So we're going to continue reading Owen Barfield's his Silver Trumpet, and we're on chapter 3, I believe. So we ended with Prince Curtsy meeting this really whimsical character, Little Fat Podger, and who basically kind of introduced him to. Oh, he hasn't yet introduced him to the two princesses. So I don't know, Jill, if you've been able to follow the story so far.
Yeah,
Uh,
I've read the whole thing and I watched the your first book club,
uh-huh.
but I've also forgotten things. So I was trying
Yeah,
to
that's
remember.
okay. So it's going to come out. I mean, everything is pretty transparent. So I'm going to start on chapter 3. So at this point, the little fat podger is taking the prince over to the garden, Queen's garden, where the two princesses are supposed to be, to introduce him to them. When they reached the queen's garden, the dwarf pointed to a tall, dark yew hedge, which looked very quiet and sleepy in the sunlight. You see that hedge? He cried. Yes, said the prince. Well, said the dwarf, the ladies are walking behind there. Goodbye. And he suddenly gave a hop and a skip and a hop and a jump away from the prince, murmuring busily to himself as he did so. 1, 2, 3, and onto it. Hi, shouted the prince. At this, the little fat podger poised on one leg, looked back over his shoulder, and sang a song. Princesses, princesses, identical dresses, and faces as like as peas. And he would have been off again had not the prince cried out appealingly that he might at least have told him the ladies' names. At that, he twirled right around on his toe, and after a pause, gave a leap back into the prince's direction, saying as he landed on both feet, Take Violetta. And then he stood quite still and nodded twice very wisely, saying as he nodded, Much better, much better. And then he took another leap toward the prince, balanced on one foot, and shouted out quite loud, If you can get her. And then he took another leap, landed right beside the prince, stretched up on tiptoe, beckoned to him to bend his head down, and seizing the prince's hair in both hands, put his lips to his ear and whispered sharply, Without Gambetta. So basically, the poem is like this. Uh, Take Violetta, much better, if you can get her without Gambetta.
Mhm.
Uh, At which the little fat podger let the prince's head uh, and let go of the prince's head and danced oddly away, murmuring to himself, to the side, point, 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 to the side, point, 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 and so vanished into the castle. The poor prince was very much bewildered by all this, and he did feel shy as he tiptoed across the wide green lawn which lay between him and the hedge. But when he went around the hedge, he found to his surprise that there was only one princess there. She was sitting reading. This must be Violetta, he thought, for she looked very beautiful. So he went up to her and kneeling on one knee, said humbly, Most gracious lady, pardon the intrusion of one who is as yet a stranger to you. If I am something too forward in my address, you might believe that it is your beauty which has stolen my manners. But Princess Gamboy, for it was she, looked up from her book and said, Stuff. The poor prince was so taken aback that he hadn't a word to say. He didn't know whether to get up or stay on his knees. At last, as he was not very clever, he said the same thing over again. Most gracious lady, pardon the intrusion of one who is as yet a stranger to you. If I am something too forward in my address, you might believe that it is your beauty which has stolen my manners. Princess Gamboy went on reading. Which has stolen my manners, repeated the prince nervously. Will you not vouchsafe? Princess Gamboy looked up and interrupted him. If my beauty has stolen your manners, young man, I should have thought the less said about it the better. And she got up, slammed her book, tucked it under her arm, and walked off. In a little while, Princess Violet came around the hedge to look for her sister. But the prince, who thought it was Princess Gamboy, come back again, pretended not to see her. She recognized him at once as the Silver Prince, who had ridden up to the gate on horseback. So she sat down on Gamboy's chair and waited for him to speak. But as he continued to stand still, with his face turned away from her, at last she rose and went to him, saying kindly, Most gracious prince, I fear you are weary after your long journey. Will you not come into the castle and there rest yourself after you have eaten and drunk your fill? Oh, lady, said Prince Courtesy sorrowfully, that is kind of you, but how can I tell uh, that even as you have just now changed from ungentle to kind, you will not change back again from kind to ungentle? Nay, I'd rather be left alone. And he shook his head sorrowfully. How politely they both talked to one another, using much longer words than they did at any other time. Wasn't it funny? I do not understand you, Prince, said Violet. I change? How changed, when until now you have never seen me? 5 minutes ago, began the prince. I was with my mother in a castle, she said. But then the prince suddenly remembered how the dwarf had sung, Princesses, princesses, identical dresses, and faces as like as peas. Yes, faces, he thought to himself. Faces as like as peas. Oh, faces to be sure, but most certainly nothing else. I'm sorry, he said humbly. I thought you were Princess Gamboy. And he knelt and kissed Princess Violet's hand and rose and went with her into the castle. From that moment began one of the strangest stories that could possibly be imagined. The prince stayed on at Mountain Castle, and of course, he and Princess Violet grew quickly fonder of one another. It was only at first that he actually used to mistake Violet for Gamboy and Gamboy for Violet. And that was only at first, because very soon he knew quite well which was which, without having to send a page for the Lord High Teller. Nobody else could ever be quite sure. But Prince Courtesy became so fond of Violet that he knew. But although whenever he saw Gamboy, he knew she was Gamboy, that didn't make any difference to the fact that he saw very, very much too much of her. It was the one thing about which he and Violet could not agree. For while Violet still loved her sister more than anything else in the world, more even than Prince Courtesy himself, the prince, well, he just didn't love her at all. She was so hopelessly in the way. It would take much too long to tell how she never left them alone, how when Violet was dancing to the prince in the west corner of the Queen's garden, she would make sarcastic remarks in a loud voice about people who wasted their time jumping about like toads. How when the prince thanked Violet for dancing so beautifully and made pretty speeches about her little feet, Gamboy would get up from her chair, slam her book, and say, Little feet indeed. Tut! How, in fact, she always managed somehow to spoil their happiness together. But one fine day, the prince, who had brought some musicians along with him in his train, ordered them after supper to come out into the west corner of the Queen's garden. First of all, out came a man carrying a little fiddle, and then came another man with another little fiddle, and then came another man with a fiddle a little bigger than these, and then another man with a fiddle nearly as big as himself. But lastly, a fifth man came with a fiddle so simply enormous that he could hardly carry it. And the men were all dressed in pink, with white frills around their wrists and necks, and yellow stockings and curly gray wigs on their heads. And they sat down and scraped their fiddles once or twice with their fiddling sticks. Meanwhile, Gamboy was grumbling surlily at not being left to read in peace because of the deafening noise that they were making. Prince Courtesy would have liked to say, "Well, go away then," but he knew Violet wouldn't like it, so he kept silence. But at last, the musicians stopped scraping. There they all sat still in the yellow sunlight with a dark yew hedge behind them. And then the first man began to play a little tune on his little fiddle. And before he had got very far, the second man began to play the same tune on his little fiddle. But the first man didn't stop playing his little tune. Oh no, he went straight on. And then the third man began to play the same tune on his fiddle, and the fourth man on his. And lastly, the fifth man began that very same tune on his great big fiddle, so low down that it sounded like growling thunder. Now, Violet and Gamboy had never heard anything like this before, and as the music played on, they dreamed that the sounds coming from the five fiddles were five shining silk threads, each of a different color, twisting and twining and curling and winding in and out and over and under one another in a marvelous pattern and always moving on and on until Violet thought, "It's better than dancing." And Gamboy thought, well, as a matter of fact, she thought of nothing at all, which was a very unusual thing for her to do. But the curious thing was that when the music stopped, Princess Gamboy sat on in silence with her hands folded across her lap, staring away into nothing. And all the rest of that evening she never spoke one harsh word. Later on, the three of them wandered around the Queen's garden, just as the sun was setting and a great golden moon rising out of the mist opposite. And the prince put his arm through Violet's, and Violet put her arm through Gamboy's, and they were all three of them so quiet and happy that they never forgot that evening all the rest of their lives. Sometimes, when they were very miserable and hot and tired, the memory of it would suddenly come back to them like a cool breeze blowing on their foreheads and make them happy again. The next morning, the prince, who had grown very friendly with the little fat podger, told him about this and asked him what he thought it might mean. "Music hath charms," said the dwarf. "Harmony, harmony. Form versus chaos. Light versus darkness. And the dominant seventh. It's all one." The prince thought this was rather foolish. It was advice he wanted, and he now asked the dwarf point blank how he might keep Gamboy forever in her gentle mood. "Prince," said the dwarf, planting his legs very wide apart, "you are a ninnikin." And he opened his legs wider and wider, for he had very few bones, and slid down till he stuck out flat on the floor, each side of him. And he jumped up and slapped both his thighs, one after the other, very quickly, saying, "1, 2. What about the silver trumpet?" he shouted. And he slapped both the prince's knees. 1, 2, so that the poor prince howled with surprise. But before he recovered himself, the little fat podger was gone. What does he mean? Thought Kersey. And then he remembered the silver trumpet hanging from his baldric, the one he had blown so boldly at the castle gate. That afternoon, Gamboy was at her old tricks again. But just as she was beginning to say something nasty and sneery about Princess, Prince Courtesy took the silver trumpet from his baldric and blew. "Your princess," Gamboy was saying, speaking half through her nose. R. Prince Courtesy reached out his hand toward the trumpet. Very fine gentleman, no doubt. Prince Courtesy's fingers closed on the handle. But whether that's a... The trumpet was at Princess Courtesy's lips. Compliment. Rooty tooty 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 too. Princess Gamboy gulped back the rest of the words and turned her nose down. Too tooty 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 too. Princess Gamboy's mouth shut with a snap. Rooty too, rooty too, rooty too. Princess Gamboy folded her hands in her lap and leaned back in the chair, staring far, far away into nothingness. She was dreaming, and oh, she was silent. After that, Violet and the prince were much happier, for the prince had only to blow his trumpet to bring them peace and the quiet that they loved. Nevertheless, their troubles were by no means at an end, nor was Gamboy subdued. As soon as the drowsy dream brought upon her by the silver trumpet began to fade, she would open her mouth and start carping and sneering more than ever, so that the prince would have to put the trumpet to his lips and blow again. And it was a tiresome thing to be continually making this odd noise all over the castle grounds. Moreover, if by any chance he left the trumpet behind in his room one day, or if the mouthpiece was clogged up so that it wouldn't blow, they were at the mercy of Gamboy's horrid tongue. At such times she seemed to be bitterer than ever, not because she had anything to complain of, but as though she were making up for all the time she had lost beneath the spell of the silver trumpet. Thus, although Violet and the prince could be sure of any number of peaceful half hours together, yet in a way matters grew worse and worse, for Gamboy had become so sharp and ill-natured that she and the prince frequently quarreled openly. After these quarrels, the prince would always feel very worried and miserable. She's Violet's beloved sister, he would say to himself, thinking sadly of the loud, unkind voice in which he had reproved her and the many things he wished he had not said because they had hurt poor Violet's tender heart. At last the prince asked Violet if she would marry him and be his queen. She told him to wait until the following day, when she would give him her answer. Now, she was certain in her mind that the answer would be yes, but all the same, she wanted to tell somebody and pretend to ask their advice. So she set out to look for Gamboy, who had been left indoors. But on the way, she met the dwarf, and he was such a very great friend of hers that she decided to tell him. So she told him. Hooray! Shouted the little fat podger. The answer is in the affirmative. And he seized hold of Princess Violet's knees, for he couldn't reach any higher, and insisted on teaching her there and then a new dance, shrieking excitedly, to the right, step, step, to the left, step, step, behind, to the side, in front, hop. They danced up and down together. Now I'm going to tell Gamboy, said Violet breathlessly. What's that? Said the dwarf, stopping short. I'm going to tell Gamboy, said Violet. Don't, said the dwarf. Shall, said Violet, still laughing. Don't, said the dwarf. Shall, said the princess, jumping up and down. Now the little fat podger hated Gamboy as much as he loved Violet, and it was a source of great sorrow for him that Violet could be so fond of anybody so disagreeable. He longed to separate them. Suddenly he changed his mind. Yes, do, he said. And then when you have told her, listen very carefully to what she says. That dwarf was a wise little fellow. He knew a hawk from a handsaw, and what is more, he knew Princess Gamboy's heart inside out. So Violet went dancing off into the castle. Create a sensation of glory in the land of Judea, she sang, till she came to where Princess Gamboy was. She was sitting in a high-backed chair casting up the accounts of the Amalgamated Princesses Society. Gamboy, dear, she began shyly. Gamboy, darling, I say, Betta. And she went on and told her everything. But when she had finished, Princess Gamboy behaved in the most unexpected way. For she got up from her chair, tucked her book under one arm, and with her hands clasped behind her back, began to stride up and down the room in silence, frowning angrily. At last she stopped and turned sharply to Violet. Listen, Violet, she said, I hate that prince, and if you marry him, I'll have no more to do with you. But Betta, said Violet, opening her eyes wide with astonishment, why do you hate him? Because, answered Gamboy. Because what's that to you, miss? I hate him. Now, which of us are you going to choose? Violet began to cry. Oh, Betta, Betta, she said, why won't you understand? He loves me, and I love him. Understand? Snapped Gamboy. Stuff. Don't you imagine that love butters any parsnips? He said he loved you. Oh, yes, he said he loved you. Of course he did. They all say that. Do you know what he really loves? Himself. You admire him so much that when he looks into your silly great eyes, he thinks himself the finest fellow that ever was. And that's what he loves. They may say what they like of little Gamboy, but she is no fool. Oh no, my dears, she is no fool. Princess Gamboy was so much pleased with her little speech that she began to strut triumphantly up and down the room, repeating the last words to herself under her breath. But inside Princess Violet's head, something seemed to snap suddenly, as though an elastic band had been broken there. It was the spell cast on her by old Miss Thompson at the christening, for there was one thing in the world strong enough to break it, and that was her love for Prince Kersey. But she did not know this, for she had never heard of the spell. She only knew that something very strange had happened to her, and from that moment on, she loved Prince Courtesy more than she loved anything else in the world. But she still loved Princess Gamboy next best. She stopped crying, and without saying a word, looked straight into her sister's eyes. Gamboy stopped still, and the two princesses stood for a whole minute, looking at each other in silence. But then Princess Gamboy's eyes fell to the ground abashed, and Princess Violet turned and left the room. She found the prince waiting in the garden. Courtesy, she cried. You needn't wait till tomorrow. The answer is yes. So I suggest we stop here. It's a long piece. Uh, so any thoughts? What do you think is happening?
I was thinking while you were reading about Little Fat Podger that he kind of reminds me of like Tom Bombadil. Just,
Hmm.
speaking in riddles and just kind
Hmm.
of being merry and dancing around and
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and he's wise just as well.
yeah.
And for some reason, I really like I mean, he seems to be so grotesque and whimsical. There's, there's something,
Yeah.
yeah.
Does the word podger have any meaning? Or it's just,
Well, that's a good question. I don't know.
I don't know if it is a word like dwarf or something like that. If it is it a colloquial expression, English of some kind. I don't know. I just
I'll have to
wonder.
look it up because, yeah. I know Owen Barfield is really big on the magic of names, so there may be some hidden messages there as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Just like Owen's grandson told us last time that even the names of Viola, and Gamba are parts of an ancient medieval instrument. Uh, Viola being the stringed part and Gamba being the pedals. underneath.
Maybe this was said last week, little sidebar, but I was looking at an Owen Barfield video of him in his 90s talking, and maybe his grandson said this, but in the video, he was saying that he was plagued by a terrible stutter when he was in school.
Mm.
And he would look ahead to the words. He couldn't give public speeches because he couldn't concentrate on two things at once, like how to present and how to catch the words. But I thought if you have to do that much science about how you're going to say a word, approach a word, go around a word, find another word, so you don't get caught in the stutter, it just seemed apparent to me why he studies words and why they mean one
Oh,
reason, you
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah, totally. Interesting.
Yeah, one of the things I think is really interesting too is like the sound of the words, like fat little podger. Like that sound is kind of
Mm.
whimsical and funny. And violet is like a flower and it's a very beautiful sound, violet. Whereas
Mhm.
Gamboy, it's like Gamboy. It's like
It's heavy.
kind of an ugly sound.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
it
Yeah.
seemed like he picked names based in Prince Courtesy. That's a very beautiful word too.
Uh-huh.
It
Uh-huh.
is, yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's a very strange name. When I first read it, it's like, what? Percy? Is this even a name? Okay.
It
Yeah.
should be.
It should be
'Cause-
a name. Yes, yes, yes.
yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Uh, this whole piece was really interesting to me when I read it and when I was also translating this whole thing into Russian as well. Because one challenge is to basically find words in another language that sound sort of create at least the same kind of a sound effect
Mm.
on the reader.
Hmm.
So that was really interesting, but challenging sometimes. But this whole thing with the musicians and then Little Fat Podger's explanation really caught my attention. That Gamboy, with all her evil nature, was subdued both by the sound of those fiddles and by the sound of the trumpet, of course, itself. And she wasn't I mean, the spell was so pronounced that even though she was although she had this evil, whatever propensity in her, it was somehow, it wasn't squashed, but it was silenced to a certain degree. And to me, I mean, when I was younger, I couldn't understand classical music very much. I mean, my mother made me go to a music school, and I took piano for 4 years, but I hated it. Hated the whole idea of it. But then later on, as life has a way of kind of correcting that, meaning that now, as I listen to some classical pieces, I can really tell how they affect my soul. Like Tchaikovsky, or I have a good friend who's a composer, and I can really tell that if there was some turmoil or chaos inside of me, the moment I start listening to some piece that I like, something immediately changes in the air, as if as if some inner settings are being changed, tweaked in me by that sound. And so the little fat podger, he explains this whole phenomenon, and he says that the way he puts it is really interesting. He basically is like music, dominant seventh, referring to the chord, I believe, the harmony. It's all one. So kind of, it seems to me that he's pointing that there's something off inside of Gambetta's heart that the music sets right by the very nature of what it is. And she kind of, for some time, at least for a short period of time, she is back in alignment with this cosmic music that fills the world.
Yeah, I was talking about that with a friend yesterday. Odd example, but recently my husband and I were trying to catch up on old movies we hadn't seen in a million years, and we watched Chinatown. And that movie, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but at the end is so dark. And dismaying. And they're in LA, and I guess it's the 40s. And you just completely crash at that moment with the characters and the way things are going to turn out. And the movie's essentially over, but suddenly this trumpet sound, they're so powerful, is how the a director chose to end the film. And and I was trying to explain it to a friend how the trumpet sound song was so powerful that it reconciled all the darkness and the light in the movie for me. And suddenly I was lifted into a knowing that I couldn't put words to express the grief and yet some of the beauty. And I just felt I use the phrase that music reconciles your emotions sometimes in this wholeness that words can't provide.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting too that like it reconciles you to something like foundational in
yeah.
creation. And the language he uses in the book, he specifically says like darkness and light and the seventh, dominant seventh, which
Mhm.
and a couple other things that bring it back to the book of Genesis, where of the original creation of the world and how we've gotten away from like what our original purpose was. And it seems like Gambetta is always squashing that creative impulse in others. And Violet represents that fresh, creative, spontaneous spirit that does seem like it's aligned with original creative work.
Mhm. Wow, thanks for bringing it up. I actually had a thought one day about the dominant seventh that Padre mentions, because God created the world in 6 days, and the seventh day was a Sabbath and the rest, when he enjoyed everything created, and basically watched like it was like, looking at that symphony that he created, and he was like in that moment. And it is sort of like a dominant. It's like a dominant in the week. It's still up to this day. We kind of work for 6 days, and then there's almost like, okay, what have I done in my 6 days? You kind of look back, you sit back, look back, and then see, can I say good enough for this or good enough for that? Sort of like, reassessment. But there's certain mystery to this whole cycle of how it plays out in individual life also. So
Mhm.
dominant seventh kind of brings it all together. So at first I was really puzzled as to why dominant seventh, but then actually, thank you, Jill, for bringing it up. I guess I almost forgot about that. Yeah. Um, so yeah, there's something else I wanted to point out.
Well, the one other thing, Jean, that I thought was so powerful was when that sister tells her she can't marry the prince, and that horrible feeling she must feel caught between different allegiances. And then the moment when she's lifted out of that, sort of it's unsaid how that happens, but her staring into the eyes. And I mean, everyone's had that problem at different times of two friends who don't like each other, relatives who don't like each other, an in-law who doesn't like this person, and you come off the holidays and sometimes you've balanced all the different likes and dislikes. And I just think it's so powerful when she overcomes the enthrallment that Gamboy has over her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting moment, when, Barfield says that something snapped in her
Yeah.
mind.
Mhm.
It was the spell. The first, I don't know if you remember, Jill, the first spell was basically that the princesses are going to be like each other, like two peas,
Mhm.
and that they're going to love each other more than anything else in the world.
Right.
And yeah, but isn't it interesting that it took love to break that spell?
Hmm.
Because basically love is the return to the original music, basically. You know.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting too that Violet, I mean, Violet seems to have her own like just a connection to music and life and dancing and responsiveness, but she really underestimates Gambetta and, eventually lets Gambetta steal the trumpet. And so that's almost like Violet's weak point. And it's not till the end of the story that she like kind of comes full circle and recognizes that. But that does seem to be a tension in the book of Violet coming to terms with Gambetta and her love and attachment for her, and not be confused by that relationship, which seems to be loving but really isn't.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, there was something else that I wanted to mention, if I can remember what it was. Oh, I think it's going to come later. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to keep reading. So we're on chapter 4. And now the story must hurry on, for there are so many more things to be told yet. So many that if you knew all that is still to happen, you would say that it has scarcely begun. Therefore, you must try and imagine to yourself what took place in the next few months. How happy the prince and Violet were together in spite of Gamboy's ill nature. How for a long time she refused to speak to either of them, and how unhappy this made Violet, though the prince didn't care a rap. But although she wouldn't speak to them, neither would she leave them alone. You see, it would have been very little pleasure to her to sulk alone in her room and from her window see them walking and whispering together in the garden. So she contrived to be always waiting round the corner, and as soon as they came near, she would get up from her chair, pull her skirts about her, and march away with her head in the air without looking at them. Or if they came into a room in the castle, she was sure to be sitting there already, and she would get up and get out and go out, slamming the door after her. This always made poor Violet feel unhappy for quite a long time, and even the prince would feel uncomfortable, which was just what Princess Gamboy wanted. You may be surprised that she should still have wanted Violet to feel unhappy when she loved her better than anything else in the world. But there are two there are two ways of loving people. One is to like seeing them well and happy, which was Violet's uh, way of loving. And the other is to like them to do what you tell them to, which was Gamboy's way. One day, Princess Violet stopped Princess Gamboy and asked her why she was so angry with her. And Gamboy raised her eyebrows and answered coldly, "My dear child, I am not in the least angry with you. Why should I be angry? I'm only concerned for your own happiness. I hope you will always be as happy as you are now." And she swept out of the room and left Violet crying. But the prince frowned and said, "Stuff," which was quite right, because it was all lies from beginning to end, and he knew it. And you must also imagine to yourself how the preparations went forward for the wedding, and how the prince began to feel horribly nervous lest, in the excitement of the moment, he should find himself married to Gamboy instead of Violet. How dreadful that would have been. But remember that the two princesses, in accordance with the law, were dressed exactly alike, and both wore their hair hanging loosely down their back and well kemmed. It might happen, you know. So at last in his perplexity, so at last in his perplexity, the prince went for advice to the little fat podger. And when he had told him his trouble, the little fat podger stood thinking for a while and then skipped away with three great grasshoppery, jiggery jumps, looking back over the shoulder and crying out at each step, "Twiddlem twaddlem 21." How puzzled the poor prince was, till suddenly he remembered having been told that the law about the princesses only held good till their 21st birthday. And then he understood what the dwarf meant. So he delayed the preparations for the wedding in spite of his impatience and arranged that they should be married on Violet's 21st birthday, when she would be able to wear what she pleased. And there's one thing I remembered what I forgot to say about the previous one. That, I think it has some significance in what's coming. Uh, it's interesting that when uh, the prince went to the Podger for advice after this whole thing with the music, uh, little Fat Podger told him, "How about the Silver Trumpet?" And it seems like he didn't really think of that. That he, I don't know, for some reason he was neglectful of that huge gift from his father from the beginning. He didn't make much of it for some reason, and that really it is some sort of metaphor because I believe we also have been given a gift. I mean, all of us have some gift, but up to a point, we don't seem to realize the full magic of that gift until we lose it, basically, until something happens and we can't really exercise that gift anymore. And then we see what we've lost. But somehow before that happens, we don't really realize how much magic we hold in our hands. So
Interesting. So that it's almost like losing the gift brings us to a consciousness of that gift.
yeah,
And what would be the purpose of that so that we can use it more fully, so that we
well,
can use the gift more fully?
yeah. I guess it's more like a point
Profoundly?
of realization or becoming conscious. Whereas it seems like Prince Courtesy wasn't conscious of what he had. He didn't realize
Right.
what he had really. And yeah, but there's so much more connected with that later on in the story. So I just wanted to for some reason I thought of that right now. I don't know.
That's interesting.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. So at last, the longed for morning came, and at breakfast time, everybody waited to see what kind of clothes the two princesses would wear. And of course, they both looked forward very much to the day when they would be able to wear what they pleased. And each of them, without saying a word to the other, had been secretly preparing for her new dress for a month past. Yet, even Gamboy was pleased and excited about this. For as she said, it was not the clothes themselves that mattered, but the liberty to choose them for yourself. By which she meant the liberty to make yourself look as ugly as you pleased. Gamboy came down first, and everybody gasped to see how different she looked from yesterday. She had put on a narrow, straight, skimpy black dress, which was no wider at the bottom than it was at the top, so that she looked like an umbrella stand. As for her hair, she had just taken hold of it with both hands, pulled it back as far as it would go over the top of her head, and tied it there with three pieces of string. But she had tied it so tightly that her eyes looked as though they were staring from her head with surprise. She did look funny. And when they saw Gamboy's hair, all the ladies in waiting at the breakfast table put down their um, knives and forks and let their bacon get cold while they giggled and tittered to each other. She's done it in a bun. She's done it in a bun. What's that? Said Gamboy sharply, and everybody dropped their eyes, picked up their knives and forks, and went on eating in silence. But then the door opened, and Princess Violet came in, and she was dressed in white from head to foot, and a skirt fell spreading from her waist so lightly that she seemed to float on air. And her beautiful long hair was piled and piled on top of her head up against a marvelous comb made of old silver, which rose above it at the back like a tower on the top of a rocky hill, or like St. Michael's Mount in Cornwall. And Once again, everybody put down their knives and forks and stared. They stared at her in amazement, for yesterday she had been a pretty little girl. Now it seemed she was a beautiful lady. And how glad Prince Courtesy was that he had waited till her 21st birthday. And even the king, who had come downstairs in a bad temper because he was to go to the wedding that day instead of going hunting, even the king smiled with delight and rose and kissed his daughter and was most sweet-tempered all the rest of the day. No fear of mistaking them now, thought Courtesy to himself, and indeed it would be hard to imagine two more different people. Their very faces no longer looked the same, though of course they were exactly the same really. And if Princess Gamboy had cared, she could have made herself look as beautiful as her sister. When Violet and Gamboy had opened all their parcels, for people receive more presents on their 21st birthday than on any other, there was a tremendous bustle throughout the house, throughout the castle, and everybody from the Lord High Teller of the other from which, who no longer had any work to do, but still went on drawing a high salary for it from the king's treasury, to the smallest and dirtiest of the stable boys, began to scrub himself up and put on his best clothes in readiness to start for the church. At 11 o'clock, every soul in the castle started off in a long, winding procession, some in chariots, some on horseback, some in sedan chairs, and some afoot, to go to the church which lay a mile off. The wedding, too, you must imagine for yourself, and how Princess Gamboy, in her skimpy black dress, sat in the front row and glowering at the bride and bridegroom all the while it was going on. She would have frowned as well, only she had tied her hair back so tightly that she couldn't move her forehead. But as the party came out of the church, the prince's herald, who had been stationed at the door, put the silver trumpet to his lips and blew. And the sound that came out of the mouth of the trumpet was rooty tootity 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 too, two tootity 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 too, rooty too, rooty too, rooty too. And Gamboy, who was just passing him as he blew, started and smiled in spite of herself, and ran as best she could in her narrow dress to Violet, and kissed her on the lips. And then the sound of the trumpet died, but then the sound of the trumpet died away out of her ears, and she fell back ashamed of herself, glowering at everybody near her, and walked on in moody silence at the tail of the procession. But when they reached the castle, there was still another surprise in store for them, for the old king came up to the prince and suddenly fell on his knees before him, offering him the hilt of his sword and saying, "Homage to King Courtesy and Queen Violet." And Violet, who could not bear to see her father kneel, put her arms around his neck and raised him up, whereupon he explained that he and the queen had decided that they were too old and too tired to reign any more, and they wished King Courtesy and his wife to govern the people from now onwards. So Courtesy humbly thanked the old king for his kindness and vowed that he would strive to be worthy of so great an honor. He and Violet took the oath there and then, and as they mounted the throne, everybody in the castle shouted aloud with one great shout, "Long live King Courtesy and Queen Violet," till the old stone walls echoed to the sound. And as they mounted the throne, the silver trumpet rang out again, high above the shouting and the din. Rooty tootity 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 too. Two tootity 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 too. Rooty too, rooty too, rooty too. And then died slowly away, while Princess Gamboy walked, as in a dream, to the foot of the throne, bowed her head, doing homage to the king and her sister, the queen. That night, lights blazed from every window in the castle, so that far away on the hills, the shepherds gathered around their fires saw three unbroken rows of little twinkling lights like stars, and they took off their caps, crying, "Long live the king and queen!" nor did they know that it was a new king and queen that they were hailing. But inside the castle, a great ball was afoot, with Japanese lanterns in the courtyard, and strawberries and peacock for supper, and the great throne hall blazing with candles. And all the while, the little fat podger danced madly in and out of the throng, leaping higher and higher. Up, 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 and again. He shrieked and turned 2 somersaults in the air because Violet was happy. Nor was the queen herself too dignified to dance a little dance of her own in the center of the hall while everybody looked on. And when she had finished, everyone applauded clamorously, not because she was queen, but because she danced like a leaf in the wind. Everyone, that is, except Princess Gamboy. She sat alone and aloof at the corner of the supper table, eating, 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 and drinking, drinking, drinking. She had not even changed her clothes, and all the time she grew more and more jealous of the prince and spiteful toward everybody. For this was not the kind of music that made her dream. Okay, it's a good place to stop. Uh, so do you think them changing clothes has any significance?
It, hearing Gamboy's, her hair tied really tight in a bun makes you think of like the the old schoolmaster who was strict and punished everyone. Like
Yeah, yeah,
kind of like that tight, like won't let. I feel like Gamboy is like she loves to she wants to be able to reason everything and doesn't really know how to deal with her feelings. Like
hmm
she gives way to the music, but then maybe is like, well, I just lost control. Like,
yeah. It's interesting that, I think it's really significant that she made it so tight that she couldn't even smile, because that's kind of also symbolic of what happens when you rely on rules and like the external I don't know standards, and really you are out of touch with the spirit, out of touch with life. So you basically cannot play. Um,
yeah.
I believe I've read once in a book, there was a Dutch philosopher who observed with concern what was happening in Germany in the 30s. And he said one thing that was obvious was that the nation was forgetting how to play. They were marching and they were doing all these things, exercises and blah, blah, blah. But they were, and then he basically said, Johann Huizinga, his name was, basically said that this nation will fall. I mean, there's going to be a fall because when you can't play, you can't innovate. There is, if you follow rules, you're basically you can't even smile. You're like, so tied up. So which kind of made me think that maybe also Owen Barfield here is playing with just kind of two realities in our lives, basically, that one is law and the other one is grace. And they seem to be always, they're not necessarily, they're twins, they're not opposite necessarily. But somehow in our experience, if we rely too much on law, we will forget how to smile. We won't be able. We're going to be too tied up, and we wouldn't be able to play or smile. Um, and then Violet, of course, represents grace and the ability to kind of flow with the spirit. And like she was dancing like a leaf in the wind, things like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, the wind is symbolic of spirit. That makes sense. I
Hmm
also think that violet like almost represents what was just said, the feeling function, the valuing function of the world, like when we really react to beauty or we respond to the joy we see in a child's face, or like your grandbaby responding to the music, like that's a valuing function that we all have. And it seems like Gamboy has lost that. Like she can't appreciate anything And love for her is not wanting to see the happiness of others, but wanting to others to do what she wants them to do. So we're replacing like valuing with control.
Yeah, it reminds me of Ian McGilchrist. Do you ever read
I
him?
do.
And
Yeah,
The
yeah.
Master and the Emissary, and she's the master of herself, sadly, because no one else is going to really follow her dictums. But she will not give because of her, like as Joellen was saying, she's like a schoolmarm in herself, and she's robbing herself of her own beauty by pulling her hair back and
Mhm.
wearing black, and she's probably denying herself before she's denying the outside world any joy or beauty. And um and I would think that when she was the most attached to her sister before the prince came, that she was getting kind of a supply of joy that way. And he broke that. And now she's just crumbling in her own darkness. You know, she's lost the blood that was coming to her from Violetta.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that they how they dressed. Like she made herself even more ugly. I mean, she wasn't ugly at all, but
Right.
because of what was inside her, it kind of came out in this kind of a really, I don't know, defaced kind of way to, if I can put it this way, to dress. You know, like like she even this dress, the way she dressed kind of made her lose her personality even more. Whereas Violet's nature came out in the way she dressed,
Yeah.
you know, even more so. You know, she literally sort of became the leaf in the wind, you know,
Light, levity. Yeah.
levity, yeah, and like, yeah. Which kind of made me think for some reason, I don't know if it has anything to do with it. Just this Christmas, my wife and I, we watched Sound of Music again. We love this movie, you know, for all the
Mhm.
music. But one thing is interesting that it starts with Fräulein Maria in the Abbey, and they all these the nuns are saying like, why she's like an angel. Some say she's an angel, others say she's like a, you know, um, what was the word that he used? It's like a, you know, a pain, like, you know, she I don't know, she doesn't follow the rules basically, but she follows this like kind of the hills are alive with the sound of music, blah blah blah. But that's interesting when she ends up in Captain Van Trapp's household. Captain is the one who is kind of grieving, is bereaved of the loss of his wife. And he follows the rules and he makes the children follow the rules, you know, and dress up and he like makes them march and there used to be music in the house, but there's nothing there. And then Maria kind of comes up and says, basically, I can't answer to a whistle. I mean, I'm not gonna whistle to them and blah blah blah. And then somehow I mean, he could have turned her out, but he doesn't because it's still in him, and he realizes something is wrong. He is under the certain, I mean, the rules are like crutches for him to go through this grieving, whatever he's going through. But then Maria shows up, and because of who she is, she brings this music back into the house. And then they're able to smile again. And the kids get it first, and then he gets it the last, you know. So it's kind of
Mm.
interesting. You know, it's also really, really mythical in that way.
Right. Yeah, that's a good illustration of everything you're talking about. And even the name of that movie, The Sound of Music.
Mhm. Mm.
Mhm.
So
You wonder if that movie could even be made now because we've gotten so cynical. You know, it's
yeah,
just.
Right.
But my when I was young, my whole family went to see it. It was a great event. You know,
I can
it was
imagine.
beautiful.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, it does make you ask the question, like, how do we bring more of that music, or how do we listen for it in our ordinary lives, and what kind of voices and situations like keep that music from happening? And which voices in my own head are like Princess Gambetta's that cut down on like creativity and joy and the things that create life.
Mm.
That's what this book is making me think about a lot.
Good point.
Well, yeah, there's so many factors in life that sort of rob us of music. And um, I mean, how would I say this? There seems to be always so many things that I can potentially start caring about, basically. Like, where does the money come from? Where does this come from? I mean, how do I take care of this? How do I, and it's often it's it robs me of the focus, and I uh if I get too like wrapped up in all those cares, I'm gonna start relying on the rules, whether I like it or not. And over time, I'm gonna emphasize the rules to such a degree that I'll forget about the spirit altogether.
Mm.
So I don't know how to explain this, but for some reason, it makes me think of the back of the Soviet Union days when I was growing up. Uh, it was a pretty atheistic society generally, with very little spirituality. And but people had a lot of cares. I mean, they were burdened with life because the economic situation and a lot of things happening politically and things like that. Uh, so I mean, how would I put this? It's really hard to uh, pinpoint what I'm trying to say. It's basically like when you feel a lot of burdens, you almost want stability at any cost. And then you kind of invent a system for yourself, which kind of
Mm.
keeps you moving, keeps you going, and then you kind of lose the music,
Mm.
in your life. So I don't know.
Well, did you find, I've always wanted to ask a Russian resident from that time, was the Orthodox Church still having services? Could you go to the church and have the music and the beauty
Yeah,
inside the church and
yeah.
feel the light?
It was active. It was persecuted, and people that went to church were frowned upon,
Mm.
and even like labeled as kind of dumb or stupid. So there's a lot of that going on, and they were ridiculed in the movies and everywhere. You could still go because um, I believe Stalin reopened the churches in 42 in the middle of, midst of the war, feeling that people needed some spiritual input to fight well, fight bad. I
Mm.
believe that's the reason. But then Khrushchev kind of closed the churches back again. I forgot when exactly they were reopened again. But when I was little, they were everywhere except my first time I went to an Orthodox church when I was 13, and I just couldn't understand what was going on. It was just too
Yeah,
foreign. It was just totally, you know,
yeah,
you know, not mainstream at all. So,
yeah. Interesting.
yeah. But there was still spirituality, strangely enough, that lived in very curious ways through
Mm.
through literature, movies, and art. I mean, it was really amazing that
Poetry, yeah.
poetry and just it's crazy. So how God was showing that music, bringing that music back. It's just like Fräulein Maria, and I brought it back into
Yeah,
rule-based societies. So
yeah, that's great. Oh, maybe you can't keep it down. It always has to come back some way or another, you know.
well, we've kind of gone for, I guess, almost more than an hour at least. I want to keep you guys too long. So thank you so much for joining. Really, really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. And thank you
Thank
also for
you.
all your wonderful essays.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're so beautiful. There's nothing quite like them,
Really,
actually.
thank you.
Yeah. So thanks.
Yes, yes. Thank you for
Yeah,
encouraging me.
definitely
Keep
your
me
silver
going.
trumpet.
Thank
That's the
you.
trumpet.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm gonna do better this time. I'll try to send the reminders. First of all, I'll send out the email with a date for the next meeting, maybe in 2, 3 days, and then I will also kind of send a reminder probably a week before, so people will have the
Okay.
all the link.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well,
Okay,
thank you for
Thank
doing it.
you.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you next time.
Take care.
Bye.
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 Bye.